to have John Milton Cooper here to talk about Woodrow Wilson tonight. This, in a way, is two events rolled into one. It's the first event of this year's Richmond Jepson Forum, where the focus is on international leadership, and the title of the series is "Where in the World Are We Going?" And we're delighted to have Dr. Cooper kick that off. It is also the James McGregor Burns lecture. The James McGregor Burns lecture series is devoted to a study of leadership studies and biography. And Dr. Cooper, again, is just the perfect person to have for that. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Wilson. He graduated from Woodrow Wilson High School in Washington, D.C. And then he graduated Phi Beta Kappa and summa cum laude from Princeton University. So the black and orange bow tie is not just about Woodrow Wilson at Princeton. He then got his PhD at Columbia University. He taught for 5 years I believe at Wellesley College, and then since 1970 he's been on the faculty, now emeritus at the University of Wisconsin. He's written a number of very, very important books. A book called The Warrior and the Priest, Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, and then a pivotal decade about the first 2 decades of the 20th century in 1991, Breaking the Heart of the World, Woodrow Wilson and the Fight for the League of Nations in 2001, and then what the New York Times called a monumental biography of Wilson that was published last year, called Woodrow Wilson, A Biography, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. There was a review in the Sunday New York Times of a biography of George Washington by Ron Chernow, and the reviewer talked about the biographer's quicksand of identifying too much with the subject. And Dr. Cooper has been involved with studying Wilson for a long time, and I think he has avoided falling into that quicksand, and his books are tremendously balanced. When I think of the very best political presidential biographies, Dr. Cooper's is clearly one. I compare it, among others, to James Thomas Flexner's Indispensable Man on George Washington, which was condensed from Flexner's 4-volume study of George Washington. And I'm just hoping that Dr. Cooper will reverse the order, and now that he's written this wonderful 1-volume study of Woodrow Wilson, that maybe pretty soon he'll begin the full 4-volume set, so we'll really understand who Thomas Woodrow Wilson was. It's really a tremendous pleasure to have one of the world's most accomplished presidential scholars here. Please welcome John Milton Cooper.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I want to say special thanks in just a minute for inviting me here. But I want to make 2 quick remarks before that. One is personal. Whenever I'm in this part of the country, and one of my cousins is out here, and she will appreciate this especially, I always want to hear how they pronounce our name. And some years ago, my colleague at Wisconsin, Paul Kunkin, who, like your president, Ed Ayers, was from Tennessee, said, "John, do you say Cooper or Cooper?" And I said, "Well, Paul, it depends on where I am and who I'm talking to." Lecture. It is a great honor. It's a special honor for me because, like Al, I've been a friend of Jim Burns's for many, many years. And I was hoping he would mention among presidential biographies Jim Burns's Roosevelt, the Lion and the Fox, the first of his 2 volumes on FDR, which I read over 50 years ago. I was an undergraduate, and I didn't read it for a course. I read it because I was interested in it, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I assigned it for a long time in my courses, and I'm Sad to say it's gone out of print, which was too bad. This is my first visit to the University of Richmond, but it's an institution I've heard about many times over the years, and I am an admirer of the contribution to Southern history of your president, Ed Ayers, whom I had a nice visit with about an hour or so ago. I also have a roundabout connection with this university, which has a bearing on the subject tonight. Years ago, I wrote a biography of the Southern reformer, magazine editor, and book publisher Walter Hines Page. And in the course of that research, I encountered Samuel Childs Mitchell, who was a professor of history here in the early years of the 20th century, and then again in the 1920s. Around 1905, Page paid a visit here and stayed with the Mitchell family, and among other things, talked with one of his sons, whose first name was Broadus. Now, anybody who's acquainted with the writing of Southern history knows that Broadus Mitchell went on to become the pioneering historian of industrialization in the post-Civil War period in the South. Broadus Mitchell was still living at the time that I did my research, and I wrote to him in search of personal impressions of Page. And he graciously replied with a very good physical description of the man and an anecdote about him, about that visit. He also included a comment that has stuck with me. Page's chief claim to historical fame remains his service as American ambassador to Great Britain during World War I and the Allied cause, and this led to an estrangement from Wilson. Page died just at the end of the war, and in 1923, the British government unveiled a tablet in his honor in Westminster Abbey. And the tablet bears the words, it bears the words, "The friend of Britain in her sorest need." By the way, there's a similar tablet to the American ambassador to Britain during World War II, John G. Wynant, again, someone who played a comparable role, perhaps. And in his letter to me, Broadus Mitchell commented on having seen that tablet and said, "I wondered whose ambassador he was." Well, that's a kind of long wind-up to delivering my pitch about Woodrow Wilson as a leader in foreign affairs, and especially his championship of the League of Nations. The first thing that needs to be said about that leadership is it wasn't something Wilson expected or particularly desired. An often quoted remark of his is an offhand comment he made to a former faculty colleague at Princeton, elected president in November 1912. "It would be an irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign problems, for all preparation has been in domestic matters." Every Wilson, including me, likes to repeat that remark because, of course, the irony of fate did overtake him in spades. In fact, that irony confronted him from his first day in office because he had to deal with the fallout from the revolution next door in Mexico. It's interesting. Centennials of revolution seem to happen at very inopportune times. I see they're trying to do something down in Mexico, and it's not too good. And then 2 years ago, Jim, remember 21 years ago, they had the Bicentennial of the French Revolution, which I think mainly should have been the Edmund Burke Bicentennial because there was just generally thought about, oh, what a disaster that was. Wilson's irony of fate grew upon him massively only a year and a half into his presidency with the outbreak of World War I. That coincided with the death of his first wife, Ellen Axon Wilson, something that just devastated him with grief. The irony gripped him even tighter with the recurring crises after a German submarine sank the British liner Lusitania, and it consumed him completely when he made the decision to take this country into the war in 1917. I think the remark deserves a bit of further scrutiny because what it reveals about Wilson's approach to political leadership. His reference to his preparation was interesting and I think in itself a bit ironic. As an active participant in politics, he didn't have much preparation at all. Just one election under his belt, less than 2 years as governor of New Jersey. What he really meant more was his long study of politics and government as a professor. he still ranks as one of the 7 or 8 truly great political scientists that America has produced. And he's the only one of them who put his knowledge and insights to work in the political arena, somebody who got to practice what he had preached for a long time. My editor on the Wilson biography made me cut out this statement. He said I was laying on the superlatives too much, but I'm going to make it here anyway. Wilson stands as the best exemplar in this country's history, and perhaps in any country's history, of the study of politics as a preparation for the practice of politics. So political scientists are here tonight. Take heed, go and do likewise. Preparation was central to Wilson in both his personal and his public life. He liked to think things through and plan ahead, which is what he did for both his governorship and his domestic presidency. And in both cases, the results speak for themselves. Students of the office of governor rank him as one of the greatest governors and one of the inventors of the modern governorship. His domestic accomplishments as president, particularly measured by legislation, put him alongside Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson in a trinity of the greatest legislative presidents. What's more, he racked up his legislative accomplishments without the benefit of the national emergency and political blank checks that FDR enjoyed, or the long habituation in and mastery of Capitol Hill that LBJ enjoyed. Remember, this was from an ivory tower academic. When Wilson first got into politics and did well from the start, reporters used to ask him how somebody with his background could do it. You know, hey doc, how is it you do so well at the real thing? He had a ready reply. He said, after academic was so much easier and more above board. And I think I hear some people agreeing with that. I sure would. One area where he didn't have much preparation was, as he admitted, foreign affairs. Still, he was not a complete innocent. At the time of the Spanish-American War, he took a lively interest in both the war and its diplomatic consequences. And one of the surprises to anybody who studies Wilson at this period in his life is to discover what an enthusiastic imperialist he was. He sounded very much like his mutually admiring acquaintance Theodore Roosevelt. And I like to say I could put a bunch of blind quotations up here on a screen and say, you tell me which one is TR and which one is Wilson. You can tell the difference if you've got a good feeling for their style, but the content, no, they're interchangeable. Well, after that brief flirtation with imperialism, Wilson did what most of his countrymen did. He largely forgot about foreign affairs over the next dozen years before he became president. The one residue I've seen from his earlier infatuation with imperialism was his willingness to intervene militarily in the Western Hemisphere. And it took the fiasco of sending the Marines into Mexico at Veracruz in April 1914 to wean him from those Roosevelt-style hankerings. So, it was a soberer, sadder, and wiser Wilson who witnessed the outbreak of World War I. From the outset, he worried what effect the emotional ties toward the belligerents would have, particularly among the large numbers of recently arrived immigrants and their children. That's why he beseeched his countrymen at the outbreak of the war to be neutral in fact as well as in name, impartial in thought as well as in deed. Interestingly, too, for such a learned person, he could be surprisingly superstitious. A month after the outbreak of the war, he told a confidant that he and James Madison were the only 2 Princeton men to become president, and he feared that the circumstances that had led to the War of 1812 were being repeated. Well, given that Wilson's mother had been born in England, and that all his grandparents had been born either in Scotland or Northern Ireland, he did feel some sentimental leanings toward the Allied side. But those things paled in the face of his revulsion from the carnage on the Western Front and his determination to keep America out of this horrendous conflict. Wilson came to believe early in the war that international relations must undergo a radical change to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. He privately told his brother-in-law that 4 principles of reform should be adopted. No more conquests, equality of rights among great and small nations, no more private manufacture of munitions, and, here I'll quote, an association of nations all bound together for the protection of the integrity of each, so that any one nation breaking this bond must bring upon itself war, that is to say, punishment, automatically. There, in germ, was Wilson's program for reforming international relations, which he later elaborated in successive pronouncements, particularly the 14 Points and the Covenant of the League of Nations. This is another example of Wilson's penchant for preparations. Unlike most politicians, he liked to move from the general to the particular, and he wanted to get his main goals and approaches straight before he moved into the particulars. In essence, that's the way the story of Wilson's pursuit of international order and peace, which came to occupy him more and more as his presidency went on. Now, such a straight-line account is in another way misleading. It feeds the commonly held view of Wilson as an idealist and a visionary who minimized or ignored reality in the pursuit of his dreams. Or, if you'd like to put a religious cast on it, a zealous prophet or a secular messiah with a surefire prescription for salvation. Wilson might have been amused to see himself depicted that way. He never regarded himself as a visionary or a prophet or a messiah. He was a disciple of Edmund Burke, and he fully embraced Burke's anti-ideological, anti-theoretical approach to politics. Again, conservative Glenn Beck hates a man who was a disciple of Edmund Burke. Well, interesting. Moreover, Wilson used a nautical analogy to explain his attitude toward principles and ideals. For him, principles and ideals were like the stars. They pointed the way to the destination. But, as he said, we aren't sailing to reach the stars. Also, the stars can only point the direction. It's the task of the sailor to navigate through wind and wave and around obstacles to reach port on earth. All kinds of circumstances intervened to buffet and to shape Wilson's pursuit of his ideas for international reform. The biggest of those, of course, was the war itself. For Americans, the great turning point came on May 7th, 1915. That's when the news reached America of the sinking of the Lusitania. This was like December 7th, 1941 and September 11th, 2001. It was a consciousness-searing event that people remembered vividly for many years afterward. It brought the shock of recognition that the war was not just a terrible cataclysm that was happening to somebody else far away. It was something that had touched them and could draw them in. For the next 2 years, from the sinking of the Lusitania and when we eventually went into the war, Wilson's task was what he defined at the outset when he said, "I wish with all my heart I saw a way to carry out the double wish of our people, to a firm front in respect of what we demand of Germany, and yet do nothing that might by any possibility involve us in the war." This is the age-old dilemma of the neutral. How do you combine peace with honor? What followed the sinking of the Lusitania was nearly a year of slow-motion diplomatic dueling with the Germans. It's a time when Wilson got attacked from both sides. There were those like his Secretary of State Bryan, William Jennings Bryan, who resigned in protest because he thought Wilson was risking war. And then there were those like Theodore Roosevelt who charged him with cowardly submissiveness. Interestingly, the president's middle course eventually paid off because the Germans backed down and reined in their submarines. As a result, from the spring of 1916 until the first month of 1917, the threat of war receded, and the main diplomatic disputes were with the British, including some things involving Ireland. This is also a time when Wilson narrowly won re-election. Now, I've argued, and I firmly believe, that this was not so much because he kept us out of war, in Europe that is. And I think it's more because he had enacted a spectacular domestic reform program, and he'd kept us out of war in Mexico. Still, he and other insiders knew that the German submarine threat was only in remission. Wilson hatched a secret plan in the event that he lost the election, whereby he would appoint his opponent's Secretary of State and then have first the Vice President and then himself resign so that the winner of the election could become president immediately and not wait for the inauguration on March 4th. The line of succession, by the way, which is not in the Constitution, it's by statute, in those days was President, Vice President, Secretary of State. When Wilson did know he'd won another term, he launched a peace offensive that included an offer to mediate the war and to lay the groundwork for a future League of Nations. Thus far, up till the end, till his re-election, he'd kept his international reform ideas largely to himself. Now, there were plenty of others, most notably Wilson's predecessor in the White House, William Howard Taft, who had publicly voiced similar ideas and formed a strong lobbying group called the League to Enforce Peace. In May 1916, Wilson publicly endorsed their ideas, but just in a general way. And in his campaign speeches, he had occasionally alluded to new structures to keep the peace. But again, he kept this very low-key, very general. But after the election, he asked the belligerent nations to stake their war aims with a view toward initiating peace talks. And he pledged that after the war, the United States would become a member of a new international organization, a League of Nations that would be empowered to maintain peace. He did this first in a diplomatic note to the belligerents, which he then made public, and then in a speech to the Senate on January 22nd, 1917. That's where he called for a peace without victory. That is, a compromise, non-punitive settlement in which no nations would be either badly beaten or decisively triumphant, and for a settlement that would be guaranteed by a League of Nations with enforcement powers. Now, that's Woodrow Wilson's preferred path to international reform. It was one in which the United States would lead the warring nations to lay down their arms and then adopt new institutions to maintain a mutually acceptable peace. It was not to be. In January 1917, the Germans decided to unleash the submarines. They fully expected this to bring the United States into the war, but they believed that they could cripple the Allies' overseas lifelines of food and munitions long before the militarily unprepared Americans could mobilize enough to send any serious forces to the battlefront. This unwise, arrogant gamble ensured Germany's ultimate defeat. I've argued elsewhere, and we can get into this maybe, that they snatched defeat from the jaws of victory here. I think the Germans were about to win the war in 1917. President Wilson hesitated for 2 months before he reluctantly decided to go into the war. He desperately sought an alternative, and he deeply feared the impact of the war at home. This is the strongest place and the one clear place where I see Wilson's deeply ingrained, but also highly sophisticated religious background having an impact, a clear impact, on his political decision-making. Some years ago, when the previous presidential administration was still in office, I made the comment that Woodrow Wilson did not take this country into war because he thought God was telling him to do it. I then said to the audience that I didn't mean that as an implied criticism of the way a certain Republican president took us into war. I added, I did not mean that as a criticism of the way President McKinley took us into war in 1898. Wilson was quite explicit on this. At the time of the sinking of the Lusitania, somebody implored him to declare war in the name of God, to which he responded, war isn't declared in the name of God, it is a human affair entirely. When he finally wrestled with his decision to intervene, He was keenly aware of the terrible risks he was taking. He knew how he might be doing the wrong thing, and he knew that he was choosing between evils, and he wasn't sure which was the greater and which was the lesser evil. He also knew that this decision was his alone. The public was sharply divided among a relatively small but extremely vocal group of war hawks, Theodore Roosevelt and company. A larger group of reconciled anti-interventionists, Bryan, my state Senator Robert La Follette, George Norris, and others. And then a big, uncertain majority still clinging to that double wish. Knowledgeable observers in Washington noted that he could have carried substantial majorities in Congress for any choice he made. By the way, this is where he was different from James Madison. He was not forced into war. I think Madison was very much forced into war in 1812. When Wilson spoke to Congress on April 2nd, 1917, and by the way, there were no leaks. Nobody knew what he was going to say. When he did that, he delivered what I consider to be the greatest presidential speech since Lincoln's second inaugural address. It's a work of somber beauty. It stresses unsought, uncertain, painful choices forced upon us. It does not issue a ringing call to arms in a holy war. The most famous line from the address is usually misquoted. This line reads, "The world must be made safe for democracy." Now, this punctilious stylist would not have used the passive voice unless he intended to. Wilson didn't believe we could make the world safe for democracy, and certainly not by ourselves. Instead, he believed we could only do our part toward making things better for ourselves and other free nations. He also stated explicitly that he wanted the same things that he had outlined earlier in the Peace Without Victory speech, namely a just and non-punitive peace and a League of Nations. But now he believed he must do this through the far less preferable, far more morally fraught means of war. I think it's significant how he ended the speech. In his final peroration, he declared, "To such a task we can dedicate our lives and our fortunes, everything that we are and everything that we have, with the pride of those who know that the day has come when America is privileged to spend her blood and her might for the principles that gave her birth and happiness and the peace which she has treasured." Any other speaker would have stopped there with those stirring words that echo the Declaration of Independence and Abraham Lincoln. But Wilson added a final sentence, "God helping her, she can do no other." That is an exact paraphrase of Martin Luther's declaration to the Diet of Worms. God helping me, I can do no other. Wilson confronted the same quandary as Luther. How does the Christian, individual or nation, act in a sinful world? As mortals, we cannot avoid sin. And Luther's answer, of course, was sin boldly. That was Wilson's answer, too, for his nation. Boldly commit this sin of plunging into the most terrible war in human history for the sake of trying to achieve greater good. The story of World War I for this president was one of triumph and tragedy. Such detractors as Roosevelt misread him when they sneered that he would fight feeble war. Wilson was determined to have his country fight with all its might. His administration brought off, again, sorry for the superlative, but it's a miracle of mobilization. We swelled the Army from a pre-war level of 500,000, which included the National Guard, to over 4 million, and 2 million of those were in France for deployment at the front by the time the war ended in November 1918. Don't get me wrong, Wilson was no deus ex machina in this. He left the military side to the professionals more than any other war president. He interested himself more in naval affairs, but his main role was to back up and prod our admirals who were pushing the British to adopt and make full use of the convoy system against the submarines, which was the long-sought defense. On the home front, he achieved what can only be called, at best, mixed results. Some of the economic mobilization, particularly in finance and agriculture, went quite well. Industrial mobilization didn't go so well. Civil liberties suffered terribly, and this despite Wilson's own fears of hysteria and repression. It remains an open question whether he and his top lieutenants might have gotten a better handle on the industrial front and reined in the excesses of vigilantism and repression if the war had lasted longer. World War I ended much sooner and much more unexpectedly than just about anybody predicted. This was Wilson's greatest achievement, and it sowed the seeds of his own undoing. He concentrated on the diplomatic side of the war. He pursued his goal of a non-punitive peace and new mechanisms to maintain international order through two principal strategies. One was to keep his distance from the Allies. He refused to make common cause with them, the way Roosevelt and others demanded. This irritated the British in particular, and at one point King George reportedly snorted, "Do we have a co-belligerent or an umpire?" Wilson's other strategy was to define war aims, which he did in a masterly way in January 1918 with the 14 points. Now, contrary to their reputation, the 14 points are mostly specific and limited measures. The term self-determination, which he didn't coin, doesn't appear in the 14 points. Wilson later did use that slogan sometimes, but he was always circumspect and specific. In all, what he was doing was holding out the promise of a reasonable and just peace with the possibility of reconciliation. And on the League of Nations, the 14 points simply said, a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual protection of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. Wilson avoided any discussion of specific plans for the League until he got to Europe after the war. The 14 points, I think, unquestionably shortened the war and saved hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of lives. Contrast the way this war ended with the way World War II ended in Europe. Those months of fierce fighting and destruction until Germany was finally conquered. But the problem was, this early, unexpected end of the war left Wilson in a much weaker bargaining position at the peace talks. If the war had gone on longer, American forces were going to play the major role in an invasion of Germany. And that would have put Wilson in a position to dictate his terms to the Allies as well as to the defeated foe. Instead, he had to spend months of grueling negotiations in Paris, which left him physically and emotionally exhausted. He did get the League of Nations, and he did get a settlement that was much less punitive than the British and French wanted. I simply do not agree with those interpreters who claim that he traded away too much for the sake of the League. Nor do I agree with those who claim that this was a fatally flawed settlement doomed to failure. I agree with the latest historian of the peace conference, Margaret Macmillan. She finds that the later failure of this peace lay not in the sins of omission or commission of the men in Paris, but in the lack of will to maintain this peace later. And we are very much complicit in that lack of will. Wilson's greatest failure as a leader came when he brought the treaty, which included membership in the League of Nations, back home and tried to get the Senate to consent to it. Much of this struggle, which has always been called the League fight, should have a familiar ring to our ears today. Partisan conflict and lack of bipartisanship lay at the heart of this unhappy outcome. Wilson certainly deserves some of the blame for what happened. As a political scientist, he had been a theoretician of party government, and as a domestic leader, he had been a practitioner of party government. The term bipartisanship would not be coined for another 20 years. And the idea of genuine cooperation between the parties was only dimly understood. Now, that's not to let Wilson off. Remember, he was also a political scientist. He was a student of parliamentary regimes. He knew how their coalitions worked. He could grasp the concept, but he failed to act on that understanding. He also failed to take either senators or prominent Republicans with him to Paris as part of the peace delegation. He had his reasons for those omissions, but I think these were mistakes. When he returned to face the Senate, the lines of support and opposition were really cast in stone, and he found little room for bargaining. Now, there's no question that Wilson wasn't at the top of his form as a leader when he embarked on the League fight. He missed opportunity to reach out to more moderate Republicans, and he sometimes seemed to lose his focus. I still think, though, he performed quite well. First, he met with individual senators for a month. Then he subjected himself to a grilling by the Foreign Relations Committee, something that no other president has ever done. They maintained the fiction of separation of powers because he invited them to the White House rather than his going down to Capitol Hill, but that's what he was doing. He was submitting himself to a grilling. And finally, he undertook a whirlwind speaking tour to whip up public opinion behind the treaty and the League. On that tour, despite his frail physical condition, he gave some of the most eloquent speeches of his life. I'll give you just one example. Speaking in San Diego, he noticed that children had flocked to see him on this tour. I know if by any chance we should not win this great fight for the League of Nations, it would mean their death warrant. They would have to fight a final war in which the very existence of civilization would be in the balance. And to reject the League would betray the sacrifices of mothers of sons who had laid down their lives for an ideal, the only thing which is worth fighting for, the spiritual redemption which rests in the hearts of humanity. The great question that hangs over the League fight is what might have happened if Wilson had stayed healthy. As you know, he didn't. 3/4 of the way through the tour, he broke down and had to be rushed back to the White House. And after he got back there, a few days later, he suffered a massive stroke. That stroke caused the worst crisis of presidential disability in the country's history. There's no question it was handled badly. There was a cover-up. And Mrs. Wilson, despite her later denials, did sometimes and in limited ways act as a surrogate president. The worst in its impact on Wilson's emotional balance and judgment. There's a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde quality to him before and after the stroke. Before, he was a resourceful, flexible leader. Afterward, he was rigid and delusional. Even though all of his advisors, including his wife, eventually urged him to compromise and to accept limited membership of the League of Nations, that's what most Republican senators would accept, Wilson refused and instead entertained fantasies about making the 1920 election a great and solemn referendum on the League and of himself running for a third term. Those things didn't happen. Instead, this Humpty Dumpty had the greatest of falls. Even though he wasn't on the ballot, the Republicans sure did run against him in 1920, and they won a victory of tidal wave proportions. For the last year and a half of his term in office, Wilson really didn't function as president. And for the not quite 3 years that he lived after leaving the White House, who regained emotional equilibrium and perspective on himself and his policies only at scattered moments. In all, it was a tragic end to one of the greatest political careers in this country's history. When Wilson died, several editorial writers compared him to Icarus, the character from Greek mythology who perished because he flew too close to the sun. That image has stuck, and the dominant view of Wilson among historians and other writers is that he was an idealist who tried to do too much, or a quasi-religious zealot who was convinced that he alone could save the world. I don't know whether those characterizations would have annoyed or amused Wilson if he'd lived to read them. As noted before, he was a disciple of Burke and had thoroughly absorbed Burke's anti-theoretical, anti-ideological approach to human affairs. He didn't see any of his programs, domestic or foreign, as revolutionary. In the case of the League of Nations, he saw this as a practical means to reform, but not to replace relations among nations. He constantly argued that it was only a beginning, a first step, and something that must adapt, change, evolve. If he had compared himself to anybody in Greek mythology, I think it probably would have been to Daedalus, the father of Icarus, the wise and circumspect one who flew closer to the earth and reached his goal. There's also another figure from Greek mythology to whom I would compare Wilson, Prometheus. Prometheus, who brought fire back from the heavens and was punished by the gods, being chained for eternity to a rock where vultures pulled at his innards. Wilson was a bold soul, somebody who dared to try great things. And his stroke, with its physical disability and emotional imbalance, I think was an earthly equivalent to the way the gods punished Prometheus. Yet to the surprise of some people, in his last years, Wilson would sometimes regain the cheerful fatalism that he had earlier adopted toward life. He told his daughter Margaret, "I think it was best, after all, that the United States did not join the League of Nations. If we had, it would have been only a personal victory. Now, when the American people join the League, it will be because they are convinced it is the right thing to do, and then it will be the only time for them to do it." And as Margaret Wilson remembered with a smile, he added, "Perhaps God knew better than I did, after all." That's a nice note to conclude on, and I will, except for making a final comment. It's unsafe the person who should have known best, but I'm not sure Wilson was entirely right. He came closer to winning the League fight than he's usually given credit for. And without his stroke, I think it's safe to say some reasonable compromise could have emerged. Whether American membership in the League and a stronger American role in world affairs in the 1920s and 1930s would have prevented World War II and all those attendant horrors, well, that's a great imponderable. There's nothing about that. But what isn't imponderable is that the chances of averting that catastrophe would have been better, and this country would have gained a generation of valuable experience as a leading power in the world. Those were what got lost in Wilson's defeat. He often said that rejecting the League would break the heart of the world, and that's what his defeat did. Thank you.